Device inverted. A 5-inch rocket was built for killing ships until 9th Air Force Thunderbolts and Navy Corsairs used it to tear open road columns in Normandy and the Central Pacific, and the German March Rule collapsed in minutes. At the Dives Valley and en route nationale near Falaise, cheap rails turned fighters into short-range artillery, and unguided salvos erased gun pits faster than a bomb truck could load. The surprise mechanic was mass. Many small warheads launched in a breath, not one heavy bomb dropped with ceremony. The price per effect fell by an order of magnitude, and maps changed before headquarters caught up. Subscribe. New World War II documentaries videos every day. The map pin sits on the low ridge east of Troon, above the bends of the Dives River, on the 18th of August, 1944, just after 9 in the morning. A weak westerly pushes low cloud at maybe 800 meters, and the hedgerows hold a damp shine from night rain. A German roadblock sits where the farm lane meets the stone bridge, with a light flak gun, 2 machine gun pits, and a pair of anti-tank teams in shallow scrapes. The old rule here is simple, and it held since the first week after the landings. Light roadblocks backed by nearby guns can delay columns for long enough that reserves arrive, because fighter bombers need time, altitude, and clear weather to drop a bomb onto a small target. The crew at the bridge trust that rule. Their range cards are marked, and their field telephone line runs to a battery on the far bank. The rupture comes low and fast. 2 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force cut across the wheat at barely 200 meters, begin a shallow climb, and then roll to a 30-degree dive. Instead of the expected 2 or 4 500-pound bombs, 8 5-inch rockets leave the rails in under 2 seconds. The rockets reach about 1,400 feet per second in a blink, and the salvo pattern scatters across the roadblock like thrown gravel. Only each stone weighs dozens of pounds and carries a delay fuse. The bridge parapet breaks, the flak gun lifts and falls crooked, and the shallow scrapes collapse. The old rule is gone in a breath, not because guidance improved, but because the method multiplied aim points. On the roads behind, a staff car pulls into a ditch to let a column of softskins pass. The drivers try to sprint the gap between hedgerow screens, a habit formed from months of living under fighter bombers that hunted with bombs and guns. That habit assumed a window. A bomb run took setup time, often 40 to 60 seconds from roll-in to release, and a gun pass telegraphed itself by a long, straight approach. The new salvo erases that window. From 0 to 8 rockets takes less than the time it takes a driver to grab second gear. The AAR page from a 9th Air Force fighter group for that day notes multiple roadblocks neutralized in less than 5 minutes per point, and a series of aerial reconnaissance photographs from the 12th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron shows fresh spall on the bridge edges and burn marks in a tight fan. The rule had been printed in German march tables the previous spring: move by night, disperse by day, harden choke points, and let artillery finish the task. At Mortain on the 7th of August, 1944, that scheme nearly stabilized a broken front. By the 18th, the same doctrine failed along the dives. Rockets changed the arithmetic because they were cheap, numerous, and quick to apply. A single bomb cost time, lift, and a careful approach. A dozen rockets cost far less in money and seconds, and they could be rippled at a short standoff that kept pilots below the ceiling and beneath radar pickets. Logistics and training vignette. In late July, crews at forward strips near Creekville and A fields, carved from beat fields, learned to mount zero-length rails and wire the firing buttons in pairs. Ordnance teams signed maintenance cards showing rail alignment within a finger's width and fuse settings checked by 2 initials. A ferry manifest carried crates of fin assemblies and warhead bodies across the channel on shallow draft barges, because space on C-47 lifts was reserved for bombs and tires. The witness objects line up: the Group AAR page, the maintenance cards with pencil ticks, and the ferry manifest stamped at Southampton. Terrain and conditions constraints matter in Normandy. Low cloud sits like a lid, and summer haze squeezes visibility under 2 kilometers by mid-morning. Hedgerows hide columns, and shallow valleys funnel windshifts that move a sight picture inches left or right at the last moment. The rockets work because the pattern covers a small field with many chances, and because the pilot can break off quickly when light flak starts to rise. The method also respects the short fields. A Thunderbolt loaded with 8 rockets and half fuel still claws off a grass strip at under 800 meters of roll if the headwind cooperates. A myth persists in many post-war accounts that rockets were precision tools, used like long-range sniper shots. The evidence shows area effects. Range tables from Navy Bureau of Ordnance list dispersion in tens of yards at typical release slant ranges, and gun camera film frames show impacts walking across a target like a line, not a point. The roadblock dies not because one rocket threads a loophole, but because 4 or 6 fall within the gun pit's world and leave no safe angle. The myth fades when the witness objects are laid side by side. Another date pins the story earlier. On the 20th of June, 1944, a Typhoon squadron of the 2nd Tactical Air Force struck a rail crossing east of Kong with 8 British 60-pound rockets per aircraft. The British weapon is not the American 5-inch HVAR, but its effect at short range mirrors the American idea, an unguided storm that gives a small team more problems than they can solve in seconds. A decoded signal summary from German field phones that afternoon reports rocket mortar fire from aircraft, proof that the crews on the ground felt artillery, not aviation. Cost bends the line as much as weather. A bomb requires handling gear, fusing benches, and careful stacking. A rocket warhead and motor screw together on a crate lid with a wrench. Production tallies from the summer list cases of motors and fins counted in the tens of thousands shipped to British ports. The per-round cost sits under $100 in wartime accounting, far below the combined cost of a heavy bomb and the hours to deliver it. The cheap flood makes the change durable. A squadron can expend dozens in a day without begging a depot chief for special favors. By the day's end on that 18th of August, roadblocks across 3 crossings have been ripped open in less than 20 minutes each. The aerial frames from the late sorties show traffic backed away from bridges and soft skins turned into the fields. German doctrine, which depended on small hard points buying time for guns, no longer works. The quiet contradiction is in the edges of the photos. Spare rockets still hang under wings on recovery because pilots no longer need to burn all ordnance to claim an effect. This was not an accident. Someone had decided to flood the front with a cheap tool that allowed many tries, not one throw. A third date ties the map pin to the ocean. On the 4th of October, 1944, far from the Dives River, a Navy Corsair squadron launches from a carrier deck in the Philippine Sea. The target is a coastal convoy. The rockets are the same 5-inch tools that smashed the Dives roadblocks. The old rule at sea, small convoys hug coasts and live under the umbrella of shore guns, starts to crack the same way. The Liver sits in Pasadena in 1942, in a Caltech lab where a physicist named Charles Lauritsen leads a wartime section under the National Defense Research Committee. He does not fly Thunderbolts or Corsairs, but he speaks the language of Bureau of Ordnance officers and range safety chiefs. The request is plain. Build a fast, simple projectile that an airplane can throw at ships from outside the flak wall and at vehicles from above hedgerows, and make it cheap enough to flood the depots. Lauritsen and his team sketch a 5-inch rocket with a solid propellant motor, a steel-cased warhead of roughly 45 pounds, and fins that fold or slot against the body until launch. The order path begins here, with a letter from the NDRC to the Navy. On the 22nd of January, 1943, a Navy Bureau of Ordnance liaison visits the Mojave tests, where early motors jump from desert rails at the Naval Ordnance Test Station near Inyokern. The Desert Range Report lists ignition spread measured in hundredths of a second, motor pressure curves, and a first set of dispersion plots at ranges under 1,000 yards. The obstacle appears immediately. Tube launchers that look neat on paper throw rockets like buckshot at any speed above 200 knots. Frames from a range camera show scorched tube mouths and nose wobble. The Navy officer returns to Washington with the film cans and a memo. Tubes will not do. Rails and stiff fins are needed. On the 12th of May, 1943, the order path bends toward the water. At Patuxent River, test pilots bolt zero-length rails to the wings of a Hellcat and a Corsair and light pairs of rockets at increasing speeds. A ship's log line from a training carrier off the Chesapeake Records deck. motion, crosswind, and the number of rounds launched past the stern. The rails shorten the launch time and trim dispersion to a tight fan that a pilot can predict with practice. Devotees of bombs object in the corridor, but the rails win in the film room. What matters is repeatability measured in tens of yards, not perfect point hits. The next step is training. Ordnance ratings learn to torque warhead bodies to motors, align fins by a stamped gauge, and set nose and base fuses by order. A maintenance card template prints checkboxes for safety pins and continuity tests. By late autumn 1943, carrier decks in the Central Pacific carry racks of warheads and crates of motors lashed near the catwalk. The decision point creeps closer. Rocket rails start appearing as standard kit, not test gear. Logistics and Training Vignette at a British strip near Thorney Island in early June 1944. An American liaison team demonstrates rail alignment to a mixed audience of RAF armorers and 9th Air Force line chiefs. A range table copied from a Navy manual sits next to a British armament pamphlet for the 60-pound rocket. The Americans talk in yards and knots. The British speak in yards and miles per hour. The witness objects, the copied tables, the checklists, the chalk marks on a wingskin, show a transfer of method more than a transfer of parts. The obstacle that nearly halts the rollout arrives in the ETO in the spring of 1944. The American 4.5-inch rocket in tubes, carried by Thunderbolts, shows ugly dispersion in the wet air and low altitudes of Normandy. Group commanders complain that the rockets walk all over the hedge instead of into the gun pit. The decision channel could have closed with rockets pushed to the side while bombs and guns carry the work. Instead, a message flows from Patuxent River through the Bureau of Ordnance to ETO Materiel. Send rails and 5-inch motors. Retire the tubes. A decoded logistics summary shows crates routed through Bristol in late June with priority stamps. On the 2nd of July 1944, a 9th Air Force wing commander signs a short order. Fit zero-length rails on a trial flight of Thunderbolts and fire-paired salvos against a chalked circle on a Sussex range. The results on film are not elegant, but they are tight enough to matter. The AAR page notes impacts inside a circle the size of a farmhouse yard at typical dive angles. A second order follows within a week. Expand rails to 2 groups and reserve an allotment of rockets for bridge interdiction west of Caen. The lever has clicked. A theater moves. At sea, the decision looks similar but moves faster. On the 14th of January 1944, a fast carrier division adopts a standard rocket loadout for its Corsair flights assigned to anti-shipping sweeps. A declog on USS Essex lists the first full complement of rails fitted to a squadron over 2 nights while the ship rolls in a winter swell. The next morning, a training strike splashes into a spray pattern on a towed pontoon target. By March, rocket rails are no longer an experiment but a default, with bombs saved for hard, big targets and rockets kept for bridges, barges, trucks, and destroyer decks. Myth versus evidence enters the room as the Typhoon appears. Many later accounts merge American HVAR salvos with British Typhoon work, as if all rockets were the same. The evidence says otherwise, and the witness objects make it plain. RAF armament pamphlets and 2nd Tactical Air Force AAR pages for June and July 1944 list British 60-pound rockets on Typhoons, not American 5-inch HVARs. The convergence is doctrinal, not material. Both air forces embrace unguided mass as a cheap, fast alternative to single heavy bombs. 3 dates, 3 places, and 3 units anchor the lever's travel. On the 30th of November 1943, Inyokern certifies a motor lot after 24 firings. On the 12th of May, 1943, Patuxent River signs off on rail patterns for carrier decks. On the 18th of August, 1944, 9th Air Force groups used the new pattern over the Dives road network. The units across those dates include a Navy test detachment, a carrier air group riding a Pacific deck, and a fighter group staged on a French beat field. The places range from Mojave Rock to Chesapeake Chop to Norman Hedgerow. By the early autumn of 1944, the decision has reached production. A Bureau of Ordnance production tally shows 5-inch motors and warheads counted by the tens of thousands, with shipments split between forward depots in Britain and Pacific anchorages at Ulithi and Eniwetok. The per-unit cost holds under $100, a number stamped on a column labeled Unit Complete. A rail set costs even less than a single 500-pound bomb fin. The cheapness is not an afterthought. It is the reason the lever moves the war. The order that makes it official is short. Adopt 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket for anti-shipping, bridges, and vehicular concentrations. Retain bombs for heavy structures. The last resistance in the chain is cultural. Bombardiers and pilots trained on the romance of a clean bomb hit feel that rockets are messy and imprecise. Range tables and gun camera frames chip that culture away. A wing commander on the Channel Coast signs an operations note on the 23rd of July, 1944, that assigns rockets to the first 2 flights on choke point patrols and keeps bombs for the 3rd flight tasked to hit a rail yard if weather lifts. The note reads like an engineer wrote it, and that tone carries into the field. The lever has been pulled, the rollout moves on its own momentum. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket is a steel tube with a solid propellant motor in the back and a warhead in the front. The motor burns in a fraction of a second and pushes the rocket to roughly 1,400 feet per second before the aircraft has moved far along its dive. 4 fins spring or fold into place as it leaves the zero-length rail, which is a small shoe bolted to the wing hardpoint. There is no guidance. The rocket flies where the aircraft was pointing at release, plus or minus the spread of the salvo and the small shifts that wind and vibration add in the first 100 yards. The steps are simple and repeatable. Crews torque the warhead body to the motor with a wrench that has a witness mark, set a nose fuse to either instant or a short delay measured in milliseconds, check an electrical continuity light, and pin the safety. The pilot lines up from a shallow climb, rolls to a dive angle between 30 and 40 degrees, and watches for the sight picture to fill to a trained size. The firing ripple is short. Most fighters can throw 8 rockets in less than 2 seconds, either in pairs or in a full string. The aircraft pulls up at once, trading speed for a short climb to escape light flak. Reliability is plain, and it is good enough. Range tables and maintenance cards logged at Patuxent River and Inyukurn show more than 9 in 10 rounds fire when commanded if the electrical leads are clean and the rockets are fresh from the crate. Misfires sit in the low single digits when humidity is high and handling sloppy. Rails, not tubes, hold the key to consistency. Tube launchers trap gases and bounce the rocket nose. Rails let the rocket leave cleanly with fins clear and a smooth spin or straight flight depending on fin design. Dispersion at typical combat ranges is measured in tens of yards, not hundreds. Witness objects make the system real. A unit AAR page for a Thunderbolt group in July lists 8 rockets fired, 6 observed impacts within a farmyard width. A ship's log line from a carrier in January notes, training salvos launched past the quarter, pattern tight and wake camera. A range table from Bureau of Ordnance lists velocity decay, fuse arming distance in yards, and recommended release slant ranges. A maintenance card from an ordnance crew chief bears ticks for continuity checks and signatures for fuse setting. Aerial reconnaissance photos from the 12th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron show fan-shaped impact scars across bridges and roadblocks. Constraints frame the method. Terrain matters. In hedgerow country, a release too low risks clipping a tree line. Too high risks a wide pattern and a miss. Over islands with coastal cliffs, the updraft near a headland kicks an approach just as the pilot squeezes the trigger. Weather rules all. Low cloud and haze compress the engagement to under 1,000 yards, slant range, and force pilots to work by feel and training, not leisurely setups. Fuel also bites. A heavy load of 8 rockets and gun ammunition trims endurance by minutes. Pilots must pick a target and go, not loiter for a second try. Myth versus evidence ties back to the documents. A popular tale says rockets were a last resort when bombs ran out. The squadron loading sheets and operations orders show the opposite. On the 18th of August, 1944, rockets are the first line against bridges and roadblocks, with bombs held for rail yards and buildings. The witness objects, loading sheets, operations notes, and the very film from gun sites leave little doubt. Rockets are planned, not improvised. The myth persists because post-war memory prefers the neat circle of a perfect bomb hit to the messy truth of an area weapon used with discipline. The system fits different airframes with small changes. On a Corsair, rails bolt to a stout wing with plenty of hardpoint structure. The aircraft carries 8 without fuss. On a Thunderbolt, rails fit outboard of gun bays, and the aircraft's mass and radial engines soak the recoil and keep the nose steady through the ripple. On a Typhoon, the British mount their own rockets, not HVARS, but the rails and ripple method look the same in gun camera film. The method's heart is not the exact rocket model, but the rhythm of the attack. Dive, ripple, pull, and leave. Training shapes that rhythm. A logistics and training vignette sits on a Sussex range in early July 1944. Pilots spend a half day firing at chalked circles and column silhouettes painted on turf. Instructors count the seconds from roll-in to release and time the ripple with a hand on the canopy rail. A range officer keeps a simple ledger of rounds fired and patterns scored. By the third run, pilots have a feel for how the fan walks across a target, and the ledger shows groups tighten by a few yards. The range table on the briefing board earns a smudge from many fingers. The method is cheap by design. Production tallies for the summer show motors, fins, and warhead bodies stacked by the crate in forward depots. A rocket uses no complex bomb hoists and requires no cradles to move across a field. 2 ratings can carry one by hand and fit it under a wing in minutes. The per-round cost under $100, recorded in a wartime accounting sheet, matters because it lets commanders accept waste in exchange for speed. When a salvo walks wide, no one writes a long apology. They launch again on the next choke point because there are more crates on the truck. 2 more dates mark the spread of the method. On the 4th of October, 1944, carrier pilots in the Philippine Sea use HVAR salvos to break a convoy under a squall line that makes bomb aiming guesswork. On the 9th of April, 1945, over Okinawa, Marines and Navy pilots use rockets to peel back beach defenses at Shuri lines at ranges too short and angles too low for safe bomb delivery and gusty winds. In both places, the witness objects, the deck logs, the AAR pages, and the aerial photos show the same fan patterns and the same quick pull-ups. Teasing the field tests is easy because the reports write themselves. The first case sits on the dives. The second rides a carrier wake. The third shifts doctrine at a wing level when a commander writes rockets into the first line of a daily tasking. Each shows a measurable effect. Minutes saved at a choke point, a convoy broken in a single pass, and a brigade road movement halted by the threat of a ripple rather than the reality of a hit. The system and method, built in a lab and proven on a desert rail and a carrier deck, now speak in short, hard lines on maps. Constraints still wait to bite. Light flak at 200 meters is lethal if a pilot lingers. Smoke and dust from the first ripple can blind the second flight. A warm motor can shift burn rate by a small percent that matters at the edge of a fan. Yet the reliability holds above 9 in 10, and the cheapness forgives the rest. The method lives in briefings and in the scuffs on rails, not in slogans. It turns fighters into artillery for a handful of seconds and then lets them be fighters again. Finally, the method's simplicity means it scales. 3 units in 3 places apply it on 3 dates with almost no change in wiring diagrams or words on a board. The 9th Air Force near Falaise in mid-August, the 2nd Tactical Air Force near Caen in late June with its own rockets, and the Pacific carriers in October and April carry the same idea forward. The maps stretch, the weather shifts, the enemy uniforms change, but the rails remain, and the fan of impacts writes the same signature on ground and water. The field tests begin with paper trails and film cans, not speeches. Range tables from desert rails sit beside carrier deck camera reels, and unit AAR pages lie open with grease on the margins. The idea has to work where maps pinch into single lanes and where a convoy thinks the surfline is a shield. 3 cases, 3 dates, and 3 different kinds of weather tell the story with numbers and objects that can be held in the hand. Case 1 sets down on the Dives River system on the 17th of August, 1944, a day before the ridge east of Troon turns loud. A battalion column feels safe under low cloud because the old rule says bombs need height and calm air. 2 Thunderbolts from a 9th Air Force group roll into a 30-degree dive and fire 8 5-inch rockets in less than 2 seconds. But a crosswind at 20 to 30 knots pushes the fan right. The roadblock cracks, but the far bank machine gun pit survives, and a field telephone wire still hums. The measurable effect is mixed. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken within 30 minutes show 1 bridge parapet broken and 3 trucks burning, yet a single pit keeps snapping until artillery speaks. The witness object that fixes the lesson is the AAR page, which notes dispersion wider than 30 yards in gusts and calls for rails to be checked with a shim tool before first sortie. Case 2 rides a wake. On the 4th of October, 1944, a Navy carrier group east of Luzon launches a Corsair division into squall lines that drop the ceiling below 1,000 feet and turn bomb sites into guesswork. The rockets are the 5-inch high-velocity type, fired in pairs at a coastal convoy that hugs the surf. The choke point is not a bridge but a bend where the shoreline forces ships inside a narrow arc. A ship's logline notes deck motion in degrees, wind over the bow near 30 knots, and 32 rockets fired across 2 passes. A towed camera shows a tight fan of water plumes bracketing a barge and a small escort. On the second ripple, 1 warhead detonates against the escort's stern and kills the rudder. The convoy turns into the wind and stalls, and the logline writes a simple sentence about a broken column at sea. Case 3 is doctrine, not just an impact. On the 23rd of July, 1944, a 9th Air Force wing commander signs an operations note that assigns rockets to the first flights on choke point patrols and keeps bombs for larger rail yards if weather lifts. The place is Sussex for the test and the Orne Valley for the action. The measurable effect shows in a decoded signal summary a week later. German march tables add an hour to daylight moves between Caen and Falaise, because air rocket fire has made roadblocks unreliable as delay points. The witness object is not a photo, but the page in the operations note that draws a simple symbol for a road bridge and writes "Rockets First" in pencil. The logistics line that feeds these tests is plain and short. On the 21st of July, 1944, a ferry manifest records cases of fins and motors landed at Southampton and moved by rail to forward depots. Maintenance cards stamped at Creekville show rails aligned within a finger's width and nose fuses set to short delay for bridge work. At sea, a deck officer's tally for a carrier division lists crates lashed near the catwalk, with warhead bodies stacked 3 high and motors in separate racks. The cheapness shows in the numbers. Per round cost under $100, rails priced below a single fin assembly for a heavy bomb, and handling time measured in minutes, not hours. Terrain and conditions shape each test. In Normandy hedgerows, a shallow valley can pull a nose left or right at the last second, and tall trees at the field edge force a pilot to enter the dive a beat earlier than he wants. On the Luzon coast, a squall front means that the sight picture appears and vanishes inside a breath, and spray from the first salvo hides the second. Across both places, the system works because it accepts the blur and trades a perfect point for a fast fan. Range tables give slant ranges in hundreds of yards. Pilots learn to feel the pattern rather than search for a static mark. A myth follows these tests and needs to be cleaned off with a rag and a number. Later stories say rockets were used only when bombs ran out, or when pilots wanted to scare columns without wasting heavy ordnance. The operations orders tell a different story, and the witness objects carry the weight. On the 18th of August, 1944, rockets are the planned first tool against bridgeheads and roadblocks, with bombs kept for marshalling yards and stone buildings. The AAR pages and the gun camera film frames back this without drama. Salvos first, bombs later if needed. The second French case comes 2 days earlier, on the 15th of August, 1944, on the Lyson River near St. Lo, where a battered bridge lies half repaired. 2 Thunderbolts drop to under 300 meters and ripple 6 rockets each. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken within the hour show fresh shearing on the upstream abutment and 4 disabled trucks nose to tail on the approach. An engineer unit that had expected a morning of patching now needs a day, and a decoded signal summary from a nearby regiment curses air mortar at the wrong time. No speech is needed. The measured delay is the point. At sea, a second case pairs with the first. On the 19th of December, 1944, off Mindoro, a coastal convoy tries to run beneath headlands and smoke laid by small craft. Corsairs fly a beam approach and fire in strings before the smoke can thicken. A ship's logline from the carrier notes smoke screens ineffective against fast fans and records 24 rockets fired to break a pair of barges and scatter the rest. The measurable effect is a halt. Radar plots show targets stop moving for 20 minutes while they try to sort themselves under the next squall. A training vignette sits between these reports. At Patuxent River on the 12th of May, 1943, test pilots practiced paired firings against towed pontoon targets behind a fleet tug. The range table on the ready room board listed fuse arming distance in yards and recommended dive angles. By the time the carriers reached the Philippine Sea in the autumn of 1944, ordnance ratings could assemble a rocket with a wrench, and a gauge faster than a bomb crew could roll a single 500-pounder to the deck edge. That time difference becomes map change when weather is bad and the window is short. The third case of doctrine change at brigade and wing level echoes again in April on another shore. On the 9th of April, 1945, during the Okinawa fight, Marine and Navy flights use rockets to peel back Shuri line positions at slant ranges, too short for safe bomb drops in gusting crosswinds. A Marine Division diary notes, rocket strikes lifted wire and posts ahead of an infantry push. The object is a simple maintenance card from a jeep that hauled crates of motors up from a beach dump at Karama Redo. It carries ticks for deliveries in the tens per hour. The measurable effect is not a spectacle, but a steady cut along a ridge that had resisted longer, slower methods. One more French lane closes the loop. On the 20th of August, 1944, near Argentan, a choke point at a culvert receives 3 flights in 30 minutes. First flight misses wide on a gust. Second flight shifts to fire from the opposite compass heading, and the fan lays across the culvert mouth. Third flight adds a short delay fuse setting that sends fragments into the embankment. Aerial photos that evening show the culvert blocked and soft skins turned into fields with ruts pointing away. The test is done in action. The rule has changed and can be repeated. The opponent does not sit still. In late August 1944, decoded signal summaries show German columns told to use smoke pots at choke points and to drag tree trunks onto bridge approaches to break up fan patterns. Camouflage nets go up over gun pits, and decoy trucks made from canvas and poles appear in farmyards. Light flak is concentrated at the likely dive arcs, and march tables add even more night movement while daylight halts stretch from minutes to hours. The countermove looks logical on paper and in a staff ledger. On maps, it underperforms because the rockets erase the margin that made these tricks enough during bomb-only months. One hard limit shows up first in the hedgerows. Release angle and height matter within a narrow band. Too shallow and the rocket strikes short and skid or ricochet. Too steep and dispersion widens into waste. A unit AAR page from the 19th of August, 1944, lists best effects at 30 to 40 degrees and slant ranges under 1,000 yards, with misfires low but present when humidity is high. Another limit lives in the fuse. Instant fuses shred sandbags and soft skins, but blow shallow against stone. Short delay fuses bite into bridge edges, but can skip in wet turf. Range tables speak softly about these limits. Pilots learn them in seconds with flak in their faces. At sea, smoke screens and tight coast hugging become the norm by October 1944. Convoys try to run inside the surf where approach geometry is ugly. Barrage balloons and hastily emplaced light guns guard the arcs. The rocket method meets this by changing the run-in rather than the weapon. Beam approaches replace stern chases, and ripples are timed to walk across wake patterns. Ships' loglines and deck camera reels show this change on the 4th of October and again on the 19th of December. The countermove loses the race against seconds. Smoke that needs a minute to build is laid against a ripple that takes 2 seconds. Refinements come from ordnance benches and chalkboards. On the 28th of July, 1944, a theater-level note revises fuse tables. Short delay is now the default for bridges and culverts. Instant remains for trucks and gun pits. On the 2nd of July, 1944, rails in Sussex receive shim kits that trim nose yaw and tighten patterns by a few yards at typical speeds. On the 12th of May, 1943, Patuxent River blessed zero-length rails that clear gases faster than tubes and cut wobble. Each small change costs little and returns measurable effect recorded on AAR pages and aerial photos. Training adjusts with the refinements. A logistics vignette shows an ordnance class at a forward strip near Lyson on the 21st of July, 1944. Armorers practice with a torque wrench that has a paint witness mark, fit fins with a stamped gauge, and check continuity lights on a simple board. A maintenance card gains new tick boxes for rail bolt torque and lid chafe. Pilots add a short drill before taxi, a hand sweep across the firing ripple switch, and a verbal count in the head to keep the 2-second fan smooth. The ledger for rounds expended and hits observed grows neater. Myth needs correction again. A later claim says rockets replaced bombs and guns, turning fighters into single-purpose rocket carts. The witness objects say otherwise. Loading sheets in July and August show mixed loads, rockets plus ammunition for guns, with bombs held for heavy structures and rail yards. Unit AAR pages list passes where rockets crack a point and guns finish the job, or where a single bomb closes a girder after rockets cut the approaches. The method is additive, not a swap, and the paperwork carries that quiet truth. Costs are paid in machines and people. Losses to light flak rise when pilots must enter below 1,000 feet to keep patterns tight. Squadron ledgers show single-digit losses per 100 sorties in August on the hedgerow front and similar rates at sea when coastal guns concentrate. Deck crews carry burns and bruises from handling hot motors under tropical sun, and 2 mishandled rounds on a pitching deck in December are logged as duds jettisoned, not fired. Production tallies in the autumn show strain too. Warhead body stocks dip for 2 weeks when a steel shipment slips, and fins are rationed to priority groups. The opponent's last countermove appears in France in late August 1944. Dig gun pits deeper and put them under trees, then move the field telephone wire away from the obvious culvert. The change helps for a day. The rockets shift aim to the approaches and the tree line rather than the pit, and short delay fuses send fragments into roots and parapets. Aerial reconnaissance photos on the 20th of August show fresh holes in embankments and lanes blocked by fallen trunks. The gun pits live, but the road they protect is gone. The delay, not the pit, is the Allied target. Limits remain even with refinements. In heavy rain, continuity can fail if leads get wet, and misfires climb into mid-single digits. Motors warmed by sun on a deck can burn a fraction faster, nudging patterns an arm's length off. In mountains, thin air stretches slant-range judgment, and rockets fall long. Range tables caution about these, and AAR pages record them without drama. The method holds because 9 in 10 rounds still fire on command, and because crates keep arriving from depots with parts simple enough to screw together on a crate lid. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, the refinements settle into routine. On Okinawa on the 9th of April, Marine and Navy flights coordinate ripples with artillery clocks to lift wire and posts in short beats. On the Rhine crossings in March, fighter bombers carry a mix of rockets and bombs, each assigned to specific spans and approaches. A decoded signal summary from a German staff warns that air rocket fire has made day movement along certain roads untenable without smoke and heavy escort, a sentence that admits the countermoves cost more than they save. The ledger closes on this act with a quiet note. The cheap rails and the short ripple have become the normal way to break a point. Immediate outcomes show as time saved and lines shortened. Between the 16th and the 21st of August, 1944, aerial reconnaissance photos across the Falaise pocket record bridges on the Dives, the Laison, and the Touquet, with fresh breaks on parapets and approaches. Unit AAR pages note roadblocks neutralized in less than 5 minutes per point, a number that reads stark beside earlier spring entries that measured delays in tens of minutes while bombers were called. On the 4th of October, 1944, A carrier group's log lists a coastal convoy stalled for 20 minutes under rocket fire, long enough for a second strike to break it apart near Luzon. On the 9th of April, 1945, Okinawa diaries mark wire and posts torn ahead of infantry within the span of a single artillery fire plan. Operational effect spreads from those dots. March tables for German units in late August add an hour to daylight moves across sectors where choke points can be seen from beat fields and ridges. Bridges that might have been patched in a morning now need a day because short delay fuses bite into edges and leave splayed rebar and rubble on approaches. On the Pacific routes, small convoys stop hugging the surf and move at night, which cuts throughput and leaves ports with gaps. Decoded signal summaries carry sentences that are not dramatic but heavy. Road movement in daylight impractical on Route Nationale near Argentan. Coastal barges delayed, escorts damaged. The resource shift is measured in crates and sorties. Production tallies for the autumn of 1944 show 5-inch motors and warheads counted in tens of thousands, shipped to forward depots in Britain and to Pacific anchorages at Ulithi and Eniwetok. A Wing's daily flying program pairs rocket patrols with rail yard bombers. The first keeps roads broken in short beats, while the second denies yards with heavier blows when weather allows. The tempo changes because the cheap tool fits into small weather windows and short pilot endurance margins. The ledger for fuel and munitions shows rockets taking a larger share at the front while bombs remain in depth. Training doctrine locks in the new rule. Range tables and armament pamphlets that once lived only at Patuxent River and Inyo now sit in forward tents and ready rooms in Sussex and Normandy and on carriers. Maintenance cards gain permanent boxes for rail bolt torque and continuity checks. Instructors write 2 short sentences on boards. Dive 30 to 40 degrees, ripple in 2 seconds. By the winter, 1944 into 1945, new pilots treat the fan pattern as normal, not novel. The method becomes muscle memory rather than a note pinned to a map. A logistics vignette shows the afterglow. In November at Southampton, a ferry manifest sends crates of fins and motors to a depot near Lyson, with a priority stamp that once belonged to bombs. Aerial reconnaissance photos in December still show fans of impacts on culverts, even as winter weather closes in. Deck logs from carriers in January record drills for jettison and misfire procedures that are now routine, a quiet sign that the weapon is no longer special. The cost per round remains under $100 in wartime accounting, which means depots keep saying yes when groups ask for more. Myth and evidence end where they began. A popular retelling says rockets won battles alone. The witness objects deny that neat story. AAR pages record bridges finished with a single bomb after rockets stuck the edges. Guns often swept a roadblock after rockets broke its spine. The rockets did not replace everything. They broke the old rule about time and setup. They created a new rule that a small, cheap storm in 2 seconds can change a local map faster than reinforcements can respond. The evidence lives in photos, ledgers, and range tables, not in slogans. The long tail runs past the armistice. In Korea in 1950 and 1951, F-51 Mustangs and F-4U Corsairs carry 5-inch rockets to cut bridges and strafe convoys on mountain roads where bombs are risky and time windows are short. Training manuals print the same dive angles and slant ranges taught in Sussex and at Patuxent River. Post-war, the idea shrinks into pods and grows into families. The simple 5-inch line yields to lighter 2 3/4-inch rockets that carry many heads, but the method remains ripple, fan, pull. The language changes, but the rails under a wing still look like the rails that left desert benches 2 years before Normandy. The opponent's legacy is quieter. March tables rewritten in late 1944 harden into caution that lasts. Daylight road movement stays rare near enemy fighters. Camouflage and night columns become habits that outlive the war. Bridge engineers build with blast on the mind and keep spare decking close. A decoded instruction set from late 1944 reads like a manual for a later war. Move by night, decoy by day, avoid choke points unless covered by heavy guns. The rockets forced that change by stripping away the comfort of "we have minutes." Operationally, the cheap storm raises tempo for the side that holds the air. In France, the closing of the Falaise pocket moves faster because choke points fail in minutes, not hours. In the Pacific, convoys shrink and scatter, which slows port inflow just as campaigns need fuel and shells. The new rule becomes invisible because it is routine. Unit diaries write, rockets fired as a short line, and staff ledgers plan around roads that can be cut in a breath. That is how doctrine dies. Not with a spectacle, but with a short entry that says a bridge is down again. The stillness returns to the original map pin at the dives. The stone parapet that broke under a fan of 5-inch warheads sits in grass now, the gouges rounded by seasons. Aerial photos that once showed burn fans and black scars are museum pieces in folders with fading stamps. The ledger closeout for that sector lists roads reopened and columns long gone east. What stays are the rails on a wing in a hangar and the range table in a binder, both whispering the same plain sentence. When fighters carry many cheap chances and can throw them in 2 seconds, old road rules do not hold.